It is the little things that you do to your garment that make it look like it was made by a professional and not a beginner. Like the bias bound seam. Welcome back, class. My name is Julianna Zinchenko and welcome to my fashion school. On this channel, you will find a ton of sewing content from Sew With Me videos to sewing tutorials. But that's not all we talk about here at my fashion school. And if you've seen my video essays, you know that. For today's lesson, I'm going to be teaching you how to sew a bias bound seam. A bias bound seam is when you encase the frayed edge of the seam allowance with a strip of fabric. This strip of fabric is called bias tape. The bias bound seam is used when you want the inside of your garment to look nice and clean, but you don't want to add a lining. The inside of your garments experience a lot of wear and tear, so you want to make sure you're covering the edges of your seam allowances so that they don't fray. Bias binding gives a beautiful, high quality finish to your garment. You can either buy bias tape at the store or you can cut your own strips out of any woven fabric that you have. Even though it will be on the inside of your garment, you of course want it to look aesthetically pleasing, so you'll probably want to either match it to the garment or choose a color that is in the pattern of the finished product or just goes really nice with it. Bias tip is basically just a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias. If you don't know what bias means, check out my last video. I talk about sewing vocab with you guys, and I even have a free PDF that you can print out, so get to studying. The reason we use bias tape is because when you cut on the bias of woven fabric, it actually has some nice stretch to it. So if you are doing a bias bound seam on curved edges, you're able to kind of stretch the fabric so it will look nice and clean. The bias bound seam is not only used for finishing seam allowance edges, it's also used to finish off facing edges and also hems. Now, I want to take a second to go over the difference between a bias bound seam and a Hong Kong seam. I was confused myself when I was learning about these seams. They look exactly the same. What is the difference? A Hong Kong seam is just like a bias bound seam. You encase the seam allowance with a strip of fabric. But the difference is, with a bias bound seam, you use bias tape that is folded in on both sides. With a Hong Kong seam, the underside of the seam allowance is left unfolded so you can see that raw edge of the bias tape. Now here's a little fun fact about bias tape. When you cut on the bias of fabric, it doesn't fray. So you don't have to worry about that bias tape edge fraying. The Hong Kong method is perfect for when you want to reduce bulk. So a regular bias bound seam adds 4 layers of bias tape, while the Hong Kong seam adds 3 layers of bias tape. Minusing that 1 layer does make a big difference. I'm going to be showing you guys an example of a bias bound seam in a pair of faux leather pants that I have. So as you can see, they did a bias bound seam right here on the waistband. And as you can imagine, if they didn't finish off this edge, it would look very messy on the inside. So we can tell that this is a bias bound seam and not a Hong Kong seam, because when you flip it over, you can see that it's folded in and this isn't a raw edge. Now, of course, you can finish off your seam allowance edges with a serger, but a bias bound seam gives off a higher quality feel. Even though nobody sees the inside of your garment, you see it. And looking on the inside of garments and seeing frayed seam allowance edges, it just throws off the vibe of your beautifully made garment. So I encourage you to take the extra steps, even though it's not necessary, to make your garment look super clean and professional. Because it's important that you know it's finished on the inside, because when you put on something that feels very high quality and very professional, it changes your whole mood, it changes your whole vibe, it changes the way you walk in the world. If you've seen some of my videos, you know I am really big on dressing well every day, and not for vanity reasons or anything superficial, but because it truly changes the way you feel. You keep your shoulders back and you hold your head a little higher. I mean, I think we can all agree that we feel much differently when we're in a pair of gray sweatpants versus when we're in a nice tailored pantsuit or even just a nice top and some jeans. To go along with this, I love to tell the story of Bill Walsh. He was the 49ers football coach, and he took them from being the worst team in football to a Super Bowl victory in just 3 years. You want to know what he did? He focused on these small things.
He focused on seemingly trivial details. Players could not sit down on the practice field. Coaches had to wear a tie and tuck their shirts in. The locker room must be neat and clean. There would be no smoking, no fighting, no profanity. The standard of performance was about instilling excellence. These seemingly simple but exacting standards mattered more than some grand vision or power trip. In his eyes, if the players take care of the details, the score takes care of itself. The winning would happen.
And that is also what I want you guys to take away from this video. It is the small things that change you as a person and also change the look and feel of your garment. All right, class, without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to know when I have new videos up. Like, share, comment, and follow me on Instagram for more fashion content and much, much more. First, let's go over what we need. We're gonna need fabric. I'm using woven fabric. You're gonna need bias tape, polyester thread, and pins. First things first, let's go over bias tape for a second. Now, like I said, you can either buy bias tape from the store or you can make your own. I'm going to be using store-bought bias tape. All bias tape is a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias that is folded in from the edges and then folded in one more time. Now, if you look closely at bias tape, you will notice that it's not folded in evenly. The bottom is a little teensy weensy bit longer than the top. This is on purpose, and you will see why bias tape is like this in just a moment. In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you guys 2 different ways to do a bias bound seam. So we're going to pretend like the raw edges of this piece of fabric I have here are the raw edges of a seam. First, I'm going to measure how much bias tape I need, and then I'm going to iron out the creases. Okay, so first things first, you want to make sure you have the shorter fold facing up. Then you're going to open up that fold and you're simply going to sandwich the raw edge of your fabric into the bias tape. I like to make sure that the raw edge of my fabric is touching that middle fold line of my bias tape. Then you're just going to close it on up and pin. You want to pin close to the edge, which is where we are going to sew, because you want to make sure that your stitch is going to catch the bias tape in the back. Again, this is the shorter fold facing up. Alright, now that we got it all pinned up, we are going to sew a straight stitch as close as we can to the edge. And don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitch. I want to clarify because I don't want this image to confuse anyone. You don't want to sew with your pins in. When your sewing machine is about to approach a pin, that's when you're going to take it out. Or else your sewing machine needle is going to hit a pin and break in half. Trust me, this has happened to me before. So I'm going to line up the edge of my bias tape along that edge of my presser foot. Now I'm just going to test out the position of my needle. I'm going to move it left and right to see where I want it to go. And I'm even going to lower it into the fabric a little bit to see where the stitch is going to land. Once you've decided how far away you want your needle to be from the edge of the bias tape, you can get to sewing and make sure you follow along that line of your presser foot. The key to getting straight lines in sewing is using some sort of guide. So whether you use the edges of your presser foot or the lines that they give you on the throat plate of your sewing machine, it will make it much easier for you to sew a straight line. And of course, the straighter the line, the more professional your garment will look. And voila, here is our finished bias bound seam. That is all it is. It is super simple. I am very pleased with how this turned out. We got as close as we could to the edge while maintaining a straight line on both sides. Now, while getting super straight stitches and having everything come out looking professional is amazing, perfectionism is not the goal. The goal is to create a one-of-a-kind piece that you made by yourself and to have fun while doing it. Do not worry about being perfect. Your skills will naturally grow over time, so just chill. Moving on to option number 2 for the bias tape finish. This one is a bit trickier than the first option, but I like this one better and you will see why. It just has a nicer look to it. Alright, first step, you want the shorter fold to be facing up, and what we're going to do is we're going to unfold the bias tape all the way, and we're going to line up the raw edge of the bias tape with the raw edge of the fabric, and we're going to pin along that first fold line you see there. Once we have it all pinned up, we are going to sew a straight stitch along that fold line. So once again, I'm going to use my presser foot as a guide. So I'm going to line up the edge of my presser foot with the raw edge of the fabric. And then I'm going to position my needle so that it's right over that fold line. Just like I did with the first option, you can see me lowering my needle to see where the stitch will end up in the fabric. And this is what it should look like when you are all finished. Don't forget to clip the loose threads at the end. You know you did it right when you flip it to the wrong side of the fabric and your bias tape covers the stitch we just sewed. This is what it looks like so far. I ironed it down just a little bit to keep the bias tape nice and flat, and this is what it looks like from the back. And what we're going to do is we're going to sandwich it with the bias tape, just like we did in the first one. And what you can do here is what we like to call grading your seam allowance, which is basically just turning your seam allowance into layered tiers of fabric. So for example, I would cut just the yellow fabric in half here. The reason for grading your seam allowance is to reduce bulk so that your seam will sit nice and flat. The next step is to sandwich the fabric into your bias tape. And like I said, when you turn it over, the bias tape will cover up that stitch in the back. And as you can see here, we did it correct because you can see that the top is a little bit shorter than the bottom. Then our next step is we are going to stitch right inside this seam right here. Yep, you heard me right. We are going to do a stitch in the ditch. A stitch in the ditch is a sewing technique where you sew in the channel of a seam, which is known as the ditch, so that the stitch appears invisible. So again, I'm going to pin where I'm going to sew, which is right along that seam line so that I can see if it will catch the bias tape in the back. Which in this case it is, so I know I am doing this correctly and this is coming out really well. This is what it will look like when it's all pinned and all of the pins have caught the bias tape in the back, so we are ready to sew. A little tip to help you sew along the seam is as you're sewing, you want to tug a little teensy bit at the bias tape until you see the threads of that seam. And those threads can be your guide on where to sew. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to align the edge of my bias tape on the 5/8 of an inch guideline on the throat plate of my sewing machine. And I'm going to make sure my needle is centered, which on my machine, that means having the setting at 3.5. Then I'm going to lower my needle into the fabric to see where the stitch is going to end up and make sure that it is aligned perfectly with the seam. And then I'm going to begin sewing and using the throat plate as a guide because again, you need guides to help you sew a straight stitch. And for this one, it is especially important because we are trying to get the stitch to disappear into the seam. And I'm not going to lie, guys, this isn't easy, especially if you're doing it for the first time. The stitch in the ditch is a bit tricky, but it is so worth it in the end because it looks so nice when you're finished. So as you can see here, I'm using my pointer finger to tug a little bit at the bias tape so that the black threads show through, and that is exactly where I'm sewing. And I promise you, you will pick this up way quicker than you think. So I really encourage you to try this method out because it is the more challenging one. Now, do not let the speed of these clips fool you. I take my time and I'm very patient when I'm doing a stitch in the ditch. This is what it should look like when it is all finished. You can see the stitch is right along that seam line. And of course I did black thread for the sake of this tutorial so you guys can see, but as you can imagine, if this thread was gray, it would hide the stitch even more. As you can see here, my stitch in the back isn't perfectly straight, but I'm not mad at it. Like I said, we're not here to be perfect, and this is going to be on the inside anyway, where no one will see it. So the next step is we're going to iron down the bias bound seam. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use our iron to flatten out the bias tape so that it spills over the stitch that we just did and it conceals it completely. And once again, we are using the tailor's clapper to make the seam nice and flat. And voila, this is what it should look like when you're all finished. And that is it for the 2 different ways you can sew a bias bound seam. Here's an example of me using a bias bound seam. I just did an invisible zipper and I used a bias bound seam to encase the zipper tape and the raw edge of the seam allowance. And as you can see, it looks so much cleaner. I used the second method, and what I did was finish off the bottom of that zipper first, and then I did the sides. All right, class, that is it for the bias bound seam tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment below or DM me on Instagram at Julianna Zinchenko. If this is your first class, I am so happy that you have enrolled in my fashion school, and there will be many more lessons to come. Class is dismissed. Love you.